Last week we heard the story of Joseph and his brothers and how the family of the Israelites ended up in Egypt. They grew and were prosperous and safe there until a new king rose over Egypt, who did not remember Joseph and his leadership in the previous crisis, or how these foreign people came to have such an integral place within their society. That Pharaoh began to imagine that the Israelites were dangerous, and so shifted the policy and the culture of Egypt until the Israelites ended up oppressed and enslaved. There was a man named Moses, an Israelite raised in Pharaoh's own house, whom God met in the desert while on the run, and God called Moses to go back to Egypt to set his people free. Moses and Aaron, his brother, had a number of conversations with Pharaoh in which Pharaoh refused, and so God began to send plagues on Egypt until a moment in which he prepared the Israelites for their escape. That moment is remembered in the book of Exodus, chapter 12, verses 1 through 13, and then continuing in chapter 13, verses 1 through 8. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, "This month shall mark for you the beginning of months. It shall be the first month in the year for you. Tell the whole congregation of Israel that on the 10th of this month they are to take a lamb for each family, a lamb for each household. If a household is too small for a whole lamb, it shall join its closest neighbor in obtaining one. The lamb shall be divided in proportion to the number of people who eat of it. Your lamb shall be without blemish, a year-old male. You may take it from the sheep or from the goats. You shall keep it until the 14th day of this month. Then the whole assembled congregation of Israel shall slaughter it at twilight. They shall take some of the blood and put it on the doorposts, and the lintel of the houses in which they eat it. They shall eat the lamb that same night. They shall eat it roasted over the fire with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. Do not eat any of it raw or boiled in water, but roast it over the fire with its head, legs, and inner organs. You shall let none of it remain until the morning. Anything that remains until the morning shall burn. This is how you shall eat it. Your loins girded, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand, and you shall eat it hurriedly. It is the Passover of the Lord. For I will pass through the land of Egypt that night, and I will strike down every firstborn in the land of Egypt, both human beings and animals. On all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgment. I am the Lord. The blood shall be a sign for you on your houses where you live. When I see the blood, I will pass over you, and no plague shall destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt." And the Lord said to Moses, "Consecrate to me all the firstborn, whatever is the first to open the womb among the Israelites of human beings and animals is mine." Moses said to the people, "Remember this day on which you came out of Egypt, out of the house of slavery, because the Lord brought you out from there by strength of hand. No leavened bread shall be eaten. Today, in the month of Abib, you are going out. When the Lord brings you into the land of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, which he swore to your ancestors to give you, a land flowing with milk and honey, you shall keep this observance in this month. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread, and on the 7th day there shall be a festival to the Lord. Unleavened bread shall be eaten for 7 days. No leavened bread shall be seen in your possession, and no leaven shall be seen among you in all your territory. You shall tell your child on that day, 'It is because of what the Lord did for me when I came out of Egypt.'" I've said it before and I'll say it again. Our stories are powerful. The stories we tell help us process to make meaning. As we tell our stories to others, they offer clues to the depths of our lived experiences, perhaps even the depths of our souls. Sometimes these are our stories of personal journeys that we have taken in life, the highs and lows, the times of triumph and trauma, stories of overcoming odds or incredible failures and lessons learned from them. Sometimes the stories are written for us, or at least the first part of the story is written for us until we pick up the pen of our lives and we begin writing ourselves. In reality, that's the way all of our stories start out. None of us is brought into this world writing our own stories from the very beginning. We are each born, for better or worse, into a family story that was being written long before we ever arrived on the scene. Family therapist and professor Elizabeth Grubel says that knowing our family stories are important. They connect us to past and previous generations. They anchor us in the present. They even have the power to shape our futures. She says that sometimes these stories are warm and uplifting. Sometimes they are heartbreaking and full of sadness and conflict. But as we enter the family story, there comes a point, a pivotal moment, when the story is not only that of our family and those generations that came before us, it becomes our story. We have a place in it because the greater story has shaped our very identity. I know that I was born into a story, or at least a chapter of a family story. It is a story that started to be written at the Ridgecrest Conference Center in Black Mountain, North Carolina, during a college ministry retreat in the early 1970s. Apparently, there were 4 individuals, 2 women and 2 men, who were tasked with going ahead of the rest of the college ministry group to get things set up for the retreat that weekend. Apparently, at some point in the evening before the rest of the group arrived the next day, the 4 members of that little advance team were sitting together in front of a fire. One of the men made some excuse for him and his buddy to leave the room. Whatever the excuse was, it was immediately clear when they returned that the real point of leaving the room was so that these 2 buddies could have a conversation of sorts. One of these 2 men was my father. He'd become incredibly taken by one of the 2 women on the trip with them. And when the 2 men entered the room again, they sat back down in opposite seats from the seats that they were in before they left the room. This allowed my father to sit next to the pretty girl with auburn hair from Columbia, South Carolina. And the rest, as they say, is history. My parents fell in love, got married, bore and raised 3 children, and are enjoying life as grandparents to 4, soon to be 5 grandchildren, watching as the next generation is writing, as they pass the proverbial pen on to us. At 14, my father was the youngest person ever hired at the time at Camp McCall, a Baptist summer camp for boys here in South Carolina. And that same year, he realized that God was calling him to preach. And from that time until this, he has dedicated himself to studying, preaching, and teaching the good news of Christ and offering pastoral leadership to congregations. My mother, well, she always knew that she was called to be a mother. That is the pure and loving essence of her true identity. But she knew that calling went well beyond just her own children and family. She wanted to ensure that as many children as possible could be touched with love, guidance, care, and be given the tools of empowerment and set on the road to success because of her work in the world. So she became a teacher and gave her life year after year to the kids who had the privilege of sitting in her classroom and learning from her, being loved by her, being held accountable by her, and being empowered by everything she did. It was a mission, and the success of that mission was evidenced by the number of students that would come back year after year to see her and talk about life and all of the different things that they were doing. Some families have generations of doctors or lawyers or other lines in the family that are followed the same careers or joined the same professions. Our branch of the King family has 2 fields that you could call our family businesses. In our family, we have ministers and educators. We even marry those who eventually become ministers who are in an educational field. Faith and education are the 2 essential ingredients to our family life. It is how our family views and moves through this world. It's how we seek to impact this world and make it better by doing what we can each day to help others love God and neighbor with heart, soul, strength, and you better believe mind. When we were called to our individual careers, I think my brother, sister, and I may have never really had a choice in the matter. We may have resisted at first. I know I did. We may have taken different paths, but we were never forced into those fields. No one told us we had to choose ministry or education. But whether it was divine intervention or the constant influence of our parents, moving into these fields were the most natural things for us to do. It just made sense. It was part of our story. Our parents also began writing a story for us that we are each continuing to live into today, but it comes more from the intangible lessons of life learned over time and with experience, or by watching our parents interact with others and help us understand the world, but that are still formed by the two sides of our family coin of faith and education. Lessons like family comes first and family sticks together through thick and thin no matter what. You are obligated to love and support your family, as evidenced by my mother's timely text messages or calls to remind us of each other's birthdays and anniversaries, or to share news of our struggles and achievements so that we can reach out to each other and celebrate with and support one another. Or lessons like everyone is made in God's image, period, no exceptions. We are all equal in God's eyes, and to believe that some people are better than others because of the color of their skin, or where they come from, or what religion they claim, or how much money they have is sin, plain and simple. So everyone is to be treated with respect, dignity, civility, kindness, and compassion. And if you see someone who is not being treated by someone else with those virtues, it is your responsibility as a child of God, a Christian, and a member of the King family to stand up for them. Or lessons like the fact that we are stewards over whatever we are blessed with in this life. Any gift we have, any talent, anything we would call a blessing isn't ours alone. It is to be used to bless the world around us, to make life better for those around us, and make the world look more like the kingdom of heaven. And these lessons are passed from one generation to the next in ways to so many other families. In conversations at family gatherings, usually around dinner tables where we share stories, remember experiences, where we laugh together and cry together. As the same stories are told time and again, they become more and more a part of the stories that each of us lives as individuals. We each have an individual and a family story that is being written right now. And then here in the 12th and 13th chapters of the book of Exodus, we find the defining story, not just for one family, but for an entire people. It is like every family story, a story that was written long before it was part of their individual lived experiences. It is the story of a God who had called a people to be a blessing to the entire world. Those people had been led to Egypt to escape hardship and famine. They settled there and were cared for. They became incorporated into the very fabric of Egyptian society. But eventually, as Exodus tells us, there arose a Pharaoh who did not know Joseph. Enough time had passed, and the story of Joseph's leadership and wisdom to save the people and the entire region, and the importance that his family played in their society, was forgotten. They stopped telling the story. So Pharaoh began to understand the story differently. He saw the descendants of Israel not as a blessing, but as a threat. That's what Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks of England says happens when we stop telling our stories. If you remember, own, and tell your story, be it as an individual or a family or society, you become confident in your identity. If you are confident in your identity, Sacks says, you have the ability to welcome the stranger, the other. But if you stop remembering, stop owning, and stop telling your story, whether as an individual or a family or society, you lose the sense of who you are. Your identity weakens, and suddenly the stranger, the other, is seen as a threat. To Pharaoh, the Israelites were a threat. He feared that as they outnumbered the Egyptians, they might rise up and rebel and overtake them. So they needed to find a way to get control of them. So he forced them into slavery. Then he made their lives miserable. Then he wanted to cut their line off at the source. So he ordered that every Israelite male that is born would be killed. but there were 2 Egyptian midwives who refused to be part of such tyrannical behavior. And the children they helped usher into this world were spared, including and most especially Moses, whom God would use to prove to the descendants of Israel and to all of humanity that God hears the cries of the oppressed. God stands on the side of the oppressed, and woe to anyone who would be caught oppressing someone else, because Exodus tells us that God is not only creator of all life, but God is also the Redeemer, actively working against oppressors to bring salvation and liberation to all people. This is the story that shapes the identity of the Jewish people and is told every year in ritualized fashion during the festival of Passover. Interestingly, its detail doesn't sound much like the rest of the Exodus story, at least this part. Its rules for the ways things were done sound more like something that you would find in the book of Leviticus, with all of its codes. But this story was told over and over again from generation to generation until at last they determined it needed to be written down. And it was important to get the details right, because when the story would be remembered, it wouldn't just be told, it needed to be acted out. It needed to be lived out in such a way that each time it was celebrated, the people would remember the work of God to defeat Pharaoh and his gods. They needed to remember that they were chosen and loved. That was their identity. They needed to remember that no matter what anyone else said about them or did to them, they were children of God. God had heard their cries. God had acted to save them. This was the moment they began to be solidified as a nation. This group of nomads turned to slaves, eventually freed, would mark that moment as the very beginning of their collective life. They started marking time from that moment. Did you hear that in the reading? God told them that the moment of the Exodus would mark the beginning of time for them. It wouldn't be marked by other gods or by any outside force. The calendar would begin with the redemptive actions of the one who is Lord of all time. And the ritual that is laid out in the original meal and then remembered in every Passover Seder from that point forward not only speaks of the redemptive work of God in that moment, but of every moment. It also speaks to the ethical conduct of their community. They were instructed to get a lamb and to prepare it to eat, but no one was to be left out. If there was a house that was too small or too poor to afford a lamb on their own, well, they were to join with another house so that they could provide for each other. The needs of the community of God, in other words, outweigh the needs of the individual. And they were to consume everything. Nothing was to be wasted. And anything that went unconsumed was to be responsibly disposed of. They were preparing to go into the wilderness, and excess does you no good in the wilderness. You have to learn to use all of what you have. Only take what you need. And it was a foretaste of the lesson that they would learn with the manna and the quail in the wilderness. The lesson that true provision comes from God and God alone. They were instructed to eat in a stance of preparation. They had their robe tied up and their staff in their hands so that they would be prepared at a moment's notice to go where God was going to lead them. It was symbolic of openness and faithfulness to the leadership of God that willingly submits to God's direction at all costs. It willingly says, my life is not my own. I will go where God calls me, when God calls me, for whatever purpose God has for me. Even the unleavened bread was a mark of faithful use of time. Sometimes you can't sit around and wait for the bread to rise. You have work to do and places to go. And when God calls you, you stop everything, you pack everything, and you go. Most importantly, this was going to become an annual meal. The story of God's saving work was so instrumental in shaping their identity that they were going to take time each year to remember exactly what happened. More important than that even, they were going to teach it to their children. They were going to teach it to each generation so that it would become theirs. In fact, in many, if not all, Jewish Passover Seders, even today, the story's told in the first person. God saved me. God saved us. This is an ordered remembrance outlined in scriptures and codified in ritualistic fashion so that it can be replicated by members of the community wherever they are scattered. It doesn't matter where they are or who they are with. Families can join in celebration and remembrance, and they can claim promises of God's liberation anew for themselves. Think of how important that must have been. It was important to remember the work of God in the wilderness as they wandered in this time of transition. That story told them that there was a purpose to it all, that God could be trusted. It was important in the diaspora, in the exile, as they were scattered around the world in captivity and away from their beloved holy city of Jerusalem. It was important during the Holocaust and any time of oppression. The ritual brings memory that leads to a sense of community that says, we were there, and so God is with us now, so we can face anything that comes our way. Rabbi Sachs says, Jews have been scattered and dispersed and exiled for 2,000 years, but we never lost our identity, he says. Why? Because at least once a year on the Passover festival, we told our story and we taught it to our children, and we ate the unleavened bread of the affliction and tasted the bitter herbs of slavery. So we never lost our identity. He says that he thinks collectively we've got to get back to telling our story, who we are, where we come from, what are the ideals by which we live. And if that happens, we all become strong enough to welcome the stranger and say, come and share our lives, share our stories, share our aspirations and our dreams. That's what we need to do as a society, he says. I think one of the holiest moments I've ever experienced was this past Maundy, Thursday in April. We were a little less than a month into the pandemic. We had all hoped it would be over by then, and that we could confidently plan together for worship, celebrate Easter Sunday, really all of the events of Holy Week as a congregation. But we came to grips with the fact that wasn't going to happen. But still, our family of faith found ways to gather in our individual homes, and when possible, logged on to Zoom. We celebrated the ritualistic meal that is at the heart of our story, because we know that it was the Passover meal that is talked about in Exodus that tells of the liberating work of God that Jesus celebrated with his own disciples when he told them that God's liberating work was being extended to all people. The Israelites had been enslaved by the Egyptians, but we'd all been enslaved to sin. But this incredible mystery of death and resurrection, there would also be liberation for all people. So he took the bread and he broke it. And he told them it was his body that was going to be broken for them. He took the cup and said that God was bringing about a new covenant that would lead to the forgiveness of sins. Instead of the blood of the Passover lamb, it would be in his blood shed on the cross. And forgiveness and new life would be available to all. And the scriptures say that he told them to eat and drink it all, not to waste it, but to take every bit of it in that they needed. And to celebrate that meal often and to remember. To remember the story that God had been writing for them long before they ever knew it. And from that time until this one, people have been celebrating that meal. They've been gathering and breaking bread and drinking the fruit of the vine, and they were remembering the defining story of all of our lives. I was thinking about that moment, not only studying these passages in preparation for the sermon, but also as the CDC came out with their recommendations for the Thanksgiving celebrations this year. Basically, they don't recommend gathering as we normally would with anyone outside of those with whom we already live in close proximity. Many of us will grieve that continued loss of connection for sure, even if it proves to be the responsible course of action. But even as we remain disconnected in ways, there are greater stories that define us as individuals, as families, and a society that space and even conflict cannot break. For those of us of the Christian faith, the story is told in the bread and the cup. We read it, we remember it, we reenact it as often as we can until it becomes ours. It is the bread of life, the body of Christ, broken for you and broken for me. It is the cup of the new covenant, the blood of Christ, shed for you and shed for me. Just like my family's story, the story that connects me to previous generations and all the saints who have come before me, this story shapes my present, anchors it. It shapes my future. It teaches lessons of the one who wrote it for us all, lessons of love of God and of neighbor, lessons of compassion and sacrifice and dying to self, lessons of forgiveness and resurrection that proceeds after death and that leads to liberation. It is that story that is the heart of a resilient faith. It has power to overcome any force that has enslaved us if we'll open ourselves to it. It reminds us that with every disconnection, every loss, everything that is literally or proverbially needed to die, God is still working to bring us to new life. It reminds us that no matter how difficult the current chapter of our story may be, we can remember. We must remember that Christ is still leading us, still building us up, still empowering us for whatever's to come. Remembering that and living into that story has the ability to build resilient faith in us all.